Ryan Oki, what's up, brother?
Hey man, doing all right,
Let's jump into it, yeah?
Cool,
We got a juicy show today.
cool.
So we are going to be talking about wokeness. In
Indeed.
fact, we're gonna, I think, title the show "Inhabit Your Wokeness," which is,
Yeah.
I think, going to be a little bit provocative
Yeah,
for
maybe
those
maybe
people who,
amongst several.
for whom wokeness kind of sits in their shadow. I think the
Yeah.
goal of this show is to try to pull it out of shadow. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that all of us here in Integral Land are generally supportive of helping to regulate basically the green altitude and try to help it however we can to shift into some of its more healthy expressions while leaving some of its more unhealthy expressions by the wayside.
Yeah.
And I think personally, we see a lot of both, a lot of healthy stuff and a lot of unhealthy stuff, a lot of babies and a lot of bathwater
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to the wokeism
Mm-hmm.
over the last
Yeah.
several years.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're gonna unpack some of this because Ryan, one of the things that occurs to me is whenever I see, well, I'm not going to say whenever, but typically when I see, I would say maybe 9 times out of 10, when I
Mm-hmm.
see a criticism of either green or
Mm-hmm.
wokeism, and we'll talk about some of the differences there shortly.
Yeah.
But whenever I see criticisms of these things online, even in integral communities,
Yeah.
it feels to me like 9 times out of 10, the critique is coming from a pre-green point of view,
Yeah.
right? The critiques are not often transcending and including the values and really
Yeah.
the urgency. And
Yeah.
it's a real urgency that's
Yeah.
animating the woke
Yeah.
movement.
Yeah.
And I think we want to, maybe do a better job of creating what I've been just generally calling a post-woke space where we
Mm-hmm.
can do exactly that, where we can transclude the very best, the very,
Mm-hmm.
very best of, sort of cutting edge green. We can support it where it's healthy. And
Mm-hmm.
hopefully we can set up, some guardrails
Mm-hmm.
around those unhealthy versions, of
Yeah.
which there are many,
Yeah.
right?
For
Um,
sure.
but this is the main problem that we're having is that I've been seeing over the last several years this almost allergic reaction and,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes appropriate reaction
Yeah.
to, against wokeism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in so doing, I often see genuine concerns around social justice being kind of thrown out the window along with it. So again,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of
Mm-hmm.
those babies in the bathwater,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we're here to rescue as many of them damn babies as we can.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think we've touched upon this kind of thing in different ways, over many episodes, but we haven't had one explicitly about this topic. And seems more relevant right now, if you look at the news, just because after shifting out of Trump era and into Biden era, and as we're looking towards, we're moving through the pandemic. I mean, we can feel the end wherever that might be in sight. And so there's pressures alleviating, I think, in certain ways, even though there's a lot of difficulty in life still. And I think because of that, it's interesting that now I'm seeing more tension around woke or post wokeism, right now coming up. Whereas for a while it was kind of quiet because for so many of us, whether green or integral, just the problems felt so heavy that like we just kind of had a lot of things got cleared out and we were just singularly focused on a few things. It's like, well, we're just dealing with this pandemic, and for a lot of us, we're dealing with Trump, and now it's like, well, we have a little more freedom to dive into more nuances. I think we talked about this before, where like we said that we're going to return to some topics that were important around this kind of thing, but like at a later point, because it just seemed irrelevant in a certain way at the time.
Well, as you often used to say, I mean, our priority at the time was putting out the fire. And the fire
Yeah,
in this case was, voting out
exactly.
the
That
Trump.
for me, that was the case. And now like there's been some fires put out from, my perspective, I think from yours too, that, and then now it's like, okay, now we're going to sniff out some other problems that were around prior, but just were not the biggest issue.
Right.
But some of these problems I think did contribute to, for example, like all the criticisms I have of the Trump administration and all that going down. I think there's things multiple factors from an integral perspective that helped set that fire. Now we're going to investigate and go through the rubble, and say, how did this happen? And I think so we're experiencing some of that. But, I think to your point, I really think the emphasis right now for me is like how to transcend and include, because there's so many issues that Green is really addressing that Green has in its sights front and center that are really important, that are unresolved. And how do we bring that forward? And to your comment about many criticisms, a lot of criticisms that you see are actually pre-Green. And so in that sense, I think we mentioned this before about a pre-trans fallacy kind of thing along, sense and integral, that there's just like, no, it's actually not post-Green. And so then the question for me is like, this is what I would just put spot on for that, to a person who's criticizing that way. What exactly about Green is good that you value, that you're bringing forward, that you think needs to happen, but you think it needs to be done in an integral way? And then I think there's a lot that would be exposed about that position. And if I don't hear much, if I hear that like racism really isn't a problem, we just need to stop talking about it or start, if they're not doing anything about it, then I'm going to be like, okay, that doesn't sound like it's post-Green.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, just to kind of set the table a little bit from my own perspective.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. You do a good job at that.
I really do see sort of the woke movement and the MAGA movement as in many ways equivalent. In many ways, I would describe them both as reactionaries reacting to reactionaries, right? And so we have this unintegrated political polarity that really comes from the top down, right? So we have an unintegrated Congress. We have an unintegrated governing system altogether. We've never had more gridlock, right, in our political system than we've had in the last 20, 25 years. Right. And this has metastasized into culture. And this has, really self-organized around all sorts of wedge issues that have become the front lines of our, never-ending culture wars. And those culture wars are only getting more and more inflamed. And of course, it requires an integral point of view in order to start seeing through those culture wars, all of these broken pieces, and to start, kind of putting them back together into, something resembling a new whole. Yeah. So I want to, say that from the outset, that it's not that we were ignoring these problems for, a few months ago. I think what it is, as we're just saying, when it comes time to act, we have to prioritize. We have to come up with a priority stack. What is the list of problems, right? Which problems are most pressing and which problems require some level of triage, right? I mean, we have to place all of our attention on this problem so that we can get to that problem over here. Well, from my point of view, we're not over the whole MAGA thing. I mean, I'm in the midst of the 6-part HBO QAnon documentary, which I highly recommend everybody out there watch. It's a really, really great documentary, and it doesn't come from any strong point of view. It doesn't come from, for example, an anti-First Amendment point of view. It's a really well done documentary. I encourage you all to check it out. But that just foregrounds for me that this problem is not over, right? I mean, we still have this ongoing problem on that side. Yeah. But I want to start talking about the problems on the left right now. Because, as much urgency as I felt around MAGA culture, a few months ago, that urgency came from the fact that these guys were in positions of power, right? And now the left is in positions of power. And I'm also not going to deny that when it comes to, the woke movement itself, it's already inserted itself into positions of power over the last several years. And I don't want people to think that we've been ignoring that. It has certainly inserted itself into academia, into Hollywood, into pop culture. I mean, it's, the cultural hegemony has been won by the left. And the economic hegemony has been won by the right. And I think that, this is an appropriate time for us to start criticizing some of the stuff that's happening in the cultural side over there. Finally, I want to say, a piece about social justice before we begin, because, I think that social justice generically includes a set of values that integralists can and probably should try to get behind. When I enact the phrase social justice, I'm immediately reminded of Carol Gilligan, actually, and how she described development.
Mm-hmm.
Carol Gilligan actually discussed development as having sort of two different paths for boys and girls. There's sort of a masculine version and a feminine version. And the masculine version tends to emphasize justice. The feminine version tends to emphasize care. They both go through the same general stages of development, but they do so with different expressions. Men tend to, emphasize justice. Women tend to emphasize care, which means boys want to make sure everyone's playing by the rules. Girls want to make sure everybody's having fun, right? That's a totally glib simplification, but it works. And to me, when I think of the phrase social justice and what it should be, what it ideally can be, is this beautiful integration of masculine and feminine values, of justice and of care. You have the justice part and you have the social part. This to me is an invitation for a more integral enactment of this phrase social justice, which was one of the reasons why I started the Integral Justice Warrior show with Diane Hamilton and now with Mark Fischler, so that we could, hopefully try to role model some of these, more integral enactments of social justice. But that's a piece that I wanted to front load into this conversation because, again, the phrase social justice, I think, sits in so many of our shadows. We relate to it immediately as like social justice warriors who are virtue signaling and, doing their Facebook hacktivism and, it's sort of peacocking, and people are rightfully critical of that. But I don't want to lose that baby in the bathwater. Social justice, there are genuine social justice warriors out there fighting the good fight and making a measurable impact in the world. And I want to honor that.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I mean, honestly, like right now, the gift of green is social justice, like, and again, in terms of execution and strategy, this is where I have usually my criticisms, is just the execution on and the strategy of it, and that's where Integral can help. But as the number of social justice issues out there right now, like just bona fide, super obvious, we don't even have to be nuanced about it. It's really obvious that it needs addressing, whether it's racial or economic social justice. It's just really obvious that we need to bring it forward. I think one of the biggest things too, for me, that comes up is around linguistics, how quickly, so often there are words used, and because this is the era of social media and there's not much room to post things, I understand that that's going to cause people to compress the words they're using, but it causes problems sometimes. So you hear social justice, and all of a sudden that word, these two words, all of a sudden refer to a whole range of things from, racism that infects the police departments, just like where we see on video, like just plain evidence, of this kind of thing. But then it also can, come down into like minutia things that get debated in academia, where like people go, oh my gosh, is this really a thing that we're debating? And is this right? And here, this is where for me in green is like prioritization. How do we prioritize the depth and importance of different social justice issues? But just go, going back to linguistics, is just so much gets packed into social justice, into woke. And then you get this debate online of like either woke or anti-woke. And really, it's like, well, are we actually debating wholesale,
Right.
those two things? Are we really concerned about a lot more nuances in there? In which case, that means we have to unpack it all. And so I'm often concerned with that of like, let's unpack all the terms. Like, let's not say, don't say woke or say woke, because that's going to be the debate. It's like, I'm going to critique wokeism and say, like, I want to get rid of that term. And then people want you to not criticize wokeism. It's like, no, we have to find a space where we can really think about this in a nuanced manner. And that first means we have to loosen up about the linguistics and demand of each other that we detail out what it is we mean. Actually, what do we mean by woke? What do we mean by social justice? But I know that's often difficult on Twitter to tease out those terms,
Well, and everything gets turned into a slogan. I mean, we have this filter, the social media filter that forces high resolution issues, it downsamples them into these low resolution takes.
Yeah, it's great for reaching a lot of people all at once instantaneously, and that raising awareness. It's really good for that, but it's really shitty for for approaching all of what is broadcasted in a nuanced manner.
That's right. I
The
mean,
medium itself is just difficult. Whether we say social media is good or bad, it's just saying like when you only have however many characters, I'm sorry.
right.
Like, do you remember having to write an essay in college and the teacher is like, you can only use 500 words. And you're like, shit. Like I have to give a whole dissertation of 500 words. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
So
or
I think
they'd say you'd have 10,000 words, so you'd pad the margins and
yeah. The biggest challenge I ever had was in grad school when it was the opposite, and they were like, you only get 3 pages. And I'm like, I got to choose all my words carefully.
Right.
So here, when we're talking about all this, like that to me is a thread throughout this entire conversation, is that if we use a word, what do we mean by the word? What do you mean by the word, listeners? And let's detail that out rather than stopping at the word and being like, you said social justice, I like it. You said social justice, I dislike it.
Right.
Who gives a shit? Like in a certain words, they're just 2 words, but what do we mean by that? So it's like, well, I definitely include seeing like every freaking other day a Black man being shot by the police, in stupid ways. Sorry, that's included for me. Does it include other things? No, it does not. And I have criticisms of things where I'm just like, no, I draw lines, but at least we can talk about that. We got to unpack it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that, so much of this really is a product of our age and how asymmetrically information is moving these days. Because I agree with you. I am getting fucking sick and tired of the heartbreak that comes with seeing these videos that come out, every other day.
Every other day.
That's right. And the problem is, of course, and this is also true on the other side of the road with the QAnon type folks. The problem is that we are so bad at handling and understanding statistical truths, and finding our place in statistics, that whenever we see something that is so just emotionally devastating, like watching any of these videos is, it gives us the sense that this is actually more prevalent than it really is. And I think that this is where we want to have a little bit of caution, because I think that, we saw this, you're talking about the linguistics. We saw this, for example, with Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Right here, we're literally, we created this massive new culture war around the distinction between the word black and the word all. And the irony there was that the meaning of Black Lives Matter, it had a world-centric message to it.
Yes.
The meaning of All Lives Matter, which sounds world-centric, actually had an ethnocentric message.
Yeah, that's right. Linguistics.
Right?
Yes.
So this shows what happens when everything gets condensed into these really super low resolution takes. Now, the opportunity there, I think, which was squandered, as it always is, by the left and the right, was to come to no, you're right. All lives do matter. The problem of police brutality, which I absolutely do think is a very, very real problem, a systemic problem in this culture, but it doesn't only affect Black people. If we can just open the conversation like that, we could even say it especially affects Black people, but this doesn't only affect Black people.
Yeah, well,
this actually helps us create the political will necessary to make some changes. The sort of political will that was getting generated, right, before the defund the police slogan came around and the all cops are bastards slogan came around. Again, just more low resolution takes, bad faith takes that are meant to hijack conversations, not produce more equitable.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's like, and especially those kind of linguistics, we're talking about developmental spiral, of like, for example, talking to conservative sociocentric individuals and like, what's the linguistic approach there? And like, what are some linguistic non-starters that will clearly, as we would expect, elicit a negative response. And even if we say, well, it shouldn't elicit a negative response because it's rational. So why should I have to change my language to accommodate these idiots? Like that's the reaction. I'm trying to bite it, but it's like, well, you have to like take a different strategic route in order to achieve the very important goals that you've set out, so that's really important. I think the linguistics, though, even aside from the developmental spiral, of like egocentric sociocentrism and world centric individuals, like even just this like green and integral, we're just dealing with these 2 developmental levels. There's linguistics to unpack, and they're like in subtler ways, like the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and then the messaging around it. That's like so like just heavy handed from an integral perspective of like kind of duh. We got to do it differently. Yeah. So where should we go with this? I mean, there's, what's funny is our good friend Vincent Horn, literally as we started this thing, he posted a tweet there that has a little 2 arrows, and one says woke and anti-woke, and on the top says meta awake.
Awake.
So he was just thinking about like getting out of this debate between woke and anti-woke.
Yep.
And then if we do that, what does that mean? How do we then talk about all of the same issues when we're not just boiling it down to like some like debate between these two orientations? Because it's like, if that's the case, then all the issues are now like you're either on one side, you're either for combating racism, or you're not. It's just like there's not an option. That's not
exactly. It's not about the what, it's about the how.
It's
like,
the how.
Yes, I want to combat racism, but guess what? I also want to preserve, the First Amendment. I want to preserve freedom of speech. I don't like censorship. You know what I mean? There's a number of, just because I agree with your values, and this is, I think, an important point, we need to learn how to identify, recognize, and even really resonate with the values that are animating this stuff, right?
Yep.
While dismissing the views, because a lot of the views are pre-green. A lot of, the prescriptions that come out of the woke movement are pre-green, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we see massive regression within woke sort of groups. We see, regression towards segregation. Segregation is actually an ideal now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting absolutely preposterous. In terms of where to go, from here, I think I wrote a piece recently that I posted to Facebook that that got a pretty positive response to it. And I was thinking maybe I could share that, because this to me has been sort of a lever that I've been pulling for the last couple of weeks that has just given me sort of a little bit of clarity and has helped me, get green out of my shadow. And I'm hoping this frame can, maybe do the same for others. So if you don't mind, can I just read this?
Yeah. And can I say one last thing to what you just said there before you get into that?
Yeah, of course.
For me, I just want to be clear that like, I'm always going to take an imperfect green strategy over somebody who's not taking any strategy towards some of these issues. So like if your values and strategy and goals don't arise at least to green, I'll still take green. And so this is why it's really important to me to identify, is this really a pre-green reaction, or is it really an integral reaction? Okay. So I don't have to resolve all the differences and in that developmental response there, like, because I'm just like, no, it's like, we at least need to minimally do this. And ideally, if we can do that in a better way, hell yeah. And I think it's going to be important that we do it in a better way, because it really matters now. It's not just a theoretical ideal. Like, we're reaching roadblocks to where if we don't do it in a better way, we won't actually reach the outcomes. We'll just be debating and fighting culturally and never get anywhere, actually. But I do rank these, I'm ranking them like, so at least has to rise to that kind of response.
Well, that's an integral skill set that I think actually denotes mature integral development. Yeah. This capacity to be intentionally, deliberately, skillfully partial.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not like I refuse to do anything until the world lives up to my expectations, which is sort of this idealistic take that I think a lot of people do, which is actually super cynical, because they're just removing themselves from the world and kind of, lobbing bombs down from their little tree houses up into the clouds. And
basically, if you're not creating anything, if you're only deconstructing, just in general, like if it's only deconstructing, then that's not really useful for me. That's right. Because we have to create something. So anyways, you brought that up for me. So go for.
So how to get green out of our shadows. So this has been a useful reframe for me, and I just want to see how it feels for you, Ryan, and for our audience. So the main, I think, lever here for me has been, rather than thinking of the green altitude as postmodern, I've begun thinking about it as pre-integral. There's something about that reframe that I very much like, as it reminds us of our obligation to properly transclude the green altitude in our integral embrace and to get it out of our own shadow. I also think it might help better facilitate post-woke discussions like this one, hopefully, while helping to remind the green altitude of what it is actually supposed to be. It seems to me that the majority of criticisms of green that I see on the internet are actually coming from a pre-green point of view rather than a post-green point of view. even, maybe especially, when the people making the criticisms think of themselves as being post-green. This gives us a better sense of the minimal, deep structures that these criticisms need to include in order to qualify as post-green. A great number of important green terms, concepts, and deep structures are maintained and updated at the integral altitude. Concepts like pluralism, which, for example, ripens as integral methodological pluralism, as well as things like constructivism and perspectivism. Even its emphasis on identity is taken up again at the integral stage, which simply offers a broader spectrum of identity to draw upon beyond these flattened types, all the way up to the supreme identity itself. Even mainstream concepts like intersectionality have a proto-integral basis to them. It's something like a flattened version of cosmic address, one that is based entirely upon types, and I think is overdue for an upgrade from an intersectionality of identity to an intersectionality of perspective, which is something that I talked to Mark Fischler about in a previous episode of Integral Justice Warrior. And let's remember, in terms of its overall structure of thought, the green altitude is described as early vision logic. It's very good at bringing all the perspectives to the table, but because it lacks a developmental point of view, it generally fails when it comes time to put those multiple perspectives together into a larger, broader, deeper coherence. So that like sort of simple trick of just thinking about green in a different way, not thinking about it as postmodern, as a reaction to modernity, and therefore something that we're kind of pushing against here with an integral, right? Rather, it's pre-integral. This is sort of formatting your hard drive, right? In preparation for the, you know, the depth and the gradations of consciousness and, you know, the more mature versions of vision logic that come online at the teal and turquoise altitudes. This has been massively helpful for me because, again, it allows us not only to get green out of our own shadows, but it also allows us to help green reclaim its own values. Right? Like I've been talking with a buddy of mine and he's been saying, I have this great new strategy. When I'm talking to green people who are sort of infected by the woke virus, I simply try to remind them, hey, aren't you supposed to be pluralistic? Aren't you supposed to be capable of holding multiple views and values at one? Like that's the whole green thing, right? And that's the first thing that wokeism kind of throws out the window. They take this fourth person perspective of, you know, all of our interlocking systems and their limitations and their historic karmas and all of that. They have a genuine fourth person perspective, cognitive point of view on these things. But when it comes time to, you know, take action and do something about it, it's all sort of mono perspectival. You know what I mean? Everything gets sort of reduced to like, no, this is the right way and everything else is the wrong way. There's nothing pluralistic about their view. Their values are pluralistic, but not their view. And therefore, that means that all of their efforts to achieve sort of their own goals, they're getting in their own ways.
Well,
right. Green values a type of harmony that green itself cannot achieve.
Yeah. Well, that's why I've said this before in the show, but it helped me clarify this in the similar way that like the languaging, like, you know, calling green pre-integral helps reframe it, especially if for anybody who sees themselves as integral, but has been very combative, you know, with green, it changes to say like, well, this is valuable because it's pre-integral. So I should want to take care of it, even if I'm going to be really critical, you know. Similarly, for me, the framing of the value, strategy, and outcomes of saying those three, like, I just want to repeat that over and over, just like if on Twitter, like differentiate your values, your strategy to enact those, and the specific outcomes you think need to happen, you know, to enact those values. And then if we can differentiate those three, we can look at effectiveness of strategies, but that gets collapsed. So that's what basically what you're saying there is it gets collapsed. Like to criticize a strategy is to criticize a value. It means you don't have the same value as me because you're criticizing my strategy. And then that's where just so many debates I see happening on Twitter with like woke, anti-woke, all this stuff is like, well, let's see. I want to identify, I share the value 100% with you, actually, 100%. I don't share your strategy. I think your strategy is horrible, which, you know, it depends. You know, it depends on what situation we're talking about. But if we can differentiate those three, the debate and conversation just goes downhill. It's really not even worthwhile, in my opinion, to engage in that kind of conversation.
That's right. Yeah, that's 100% true. And I think this actually gets us to, when we talk about what is the sort of anatomy of the woke movement, because I think there's a lot of resistance, and I think rightfully so, to just sort of labeling wokeism as another green project, because it's not just green. Like, yeah, they've adopted green slogans and values, the type of things that you find on most college campuses around the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of those values are at least repeated as sound bites when it comes to the woke movement. However, the way those things are actually being enacted, it's being enacted in an amber way. I mean, this is a new kind of, in many ways, a new kind of authoritarianism that's coming from the left.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Yeah,
not
sure.
like, oh my God, authoritarianism on the left. I mean, this shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. I mean, either wing can easily regress into autocracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've got Hitler on one side, you got Stalin on the other. I mean, those are your guardrails for civilization, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it shouldn't be too surprising that, that this sort of Marxist informed strategy that's animating wokeism would take on a few sort of totalitarian strategies of its own. And I think that that's sort of the real problem that we're facing right now.
Yeah.
And the other problem that I've been repeating a lot, Ryan, is simply, when it comes to like identity politics and intersectionality and all that, it seems like a lot of the problems are coming from the fact that because people are not very aware that like growth and development is a thing, right?
Yeah,
They think
yeah,
that
absolutely.
growth and development stops at like high school or maybe
Yeah.
college,
Yeah.
because that's not part of sort of the, our cultural fabric. All we have to sort of suss each other out are types. So we type each other endlessly.
Right.
And that's what intersectionality is. It's an intersectionality of types. What are your types? Well, you're gay, or you're straight, or you're cisgendered, or you know what I mean, or you're white, or you're black, or you're this ethnicity or that. And these types are immutable, right? Like this, I was just asked by John Dupuy. John Dupuy sent me an email and he goes, Corey, why do wokeists suddenly hate Martin Luther King Jr.? And I'm like, first off, I didn't realize they did. And then I researched it a little bit and I'm like, no, a lot of wokists have issue with Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, really?
Who I see as like, an integral leader before integral was a thing, because he led in all four quadrants simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. Yeah,
absolutely. And my only guess, my response to John was, my only guess here is because, when he says that we should not judge each other based on the color of our skin, but the content of our character, well, guess what? The color of your skin is a lot more noticeable, more immutable, whereas character, that requires development. People don't know development exists. Instead, it's, you were the type of person who could say something racist 20 years ago. Therefore, you're still the type of person who would say something racist. There's no sense of progress or development, or like,
for sure,
20 years ago, and hopefully we got better.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest ones there, is just like no sense of a path forward, right? Of like, okay, just be really transparent. Like, okay, just like in our justice system, it's like, what are you're being arrested? What for? Okay, well, what are the charges? Okay, here's a trial, and here are the different results that this trial could end in, and here are the different punishments, and here's how you redeem yourself after serving your punishment, and here are your rights afterwards. All these things we have built into our justice system, oftentimes culturally speaking. Sometimes green responses can lack a lot of that, where it's just like brutal, like in terms of the response quickly. And again, I'm still going to say that, like, I'm going to take a response over no response to injustice in a certain way, so long as it doesn't cause an equal or greater injustice. You know what I mean? So, and I get, like, we have to say, well, how do we know that? And I'd be like, that's a great question. And like, we'd have to look at situations, and that's where we'd have a debate. Like, how do we expose our thought process, right? And this is an integral thing too, to know that we have a subjective structure of mind that is interpreting everything that we are viewing, but like to expose that and say, let's look at that. you know. But that definitely is one thing that I keep saying, like, if we don't have that, we're going to stall out a little bit in our progress towards these green values. If we don't have a sense of like prioritization on crimes, actual legal crimes, or cultural, you know, rules, that cultural norms, you know, we have to know, like, what are they, and what's a sense of redemption in that whole process, which is ironic because we have such a thing in on the left about supporting rehabilitation, you know, in prisoners. Like, we have that sense with prisoners, but it's really funny if you look culturally and you go by Twitter and stuff, there's no sense of that, you know, a lot of many times.
No, I mean, like, things like prison rape are still an acceptable cultural joke.
Yeah,
As an example.
Yeah. So I mean, what's interesting is like, and I'm sure you all are talking about this and the other shows, like more specific situations. Here we're kind of unpacking a little bit like how we all orient to the various situations that are unfolding in the country and the world, focused on that versus like any particular situation. Although, you know, honing in on particular situations could make it much easier to see our habitual responses and you know, and to actually debate what the response should be to what's going on.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring the topic into this show, Ryan, not only because you're brilliant and I want your, you know,
I don't know about that, but I'm happy to talk.
but also this is an opportunity, I think, an invitation to not just sort of talk about these values, but to genuinely inhabit them.
Yeah.
Right. To really try to resonate with, you know, the healthiest version of the green values, even the healthiest version of the amber values that have infected wokeism. Because, you know, I know that I've been saying for 20 years now that the Democrats need more amber. Right? Like, they need to figure out how to straighten their spines, and they need to figure out how to like toe the line together. That's something that the Republicans have just nailed. And, you know, the Republicans are really good at getting on message. The Democrats tend to be, you know, it's sort of uncomfortable coalitions and all of that. So it's a little bit more difficult to get Democrats in line. So I've been saying for years, like, I want more amber, but I want, you know, a healthy amber. I don't want the left to surrender patriotism, for example, to the right. I don't want the left to surrender the concept of a moral majority to the right. I mean, you know, there are obviously critically important amber values and institutions which unfortunately have been deconstructed by the left over the last 50 to 60 years, which has, you know, in many ways resulted in the world that we live in today. So, you know, the left is not faultless here. They're not just sort of the victims being like, oh,
yeah, for sure.
Like, no, you created the conditions of oppression just as much as anybody else. And now we have to find another way forward. And hopefully it's a way forward that sort of cuts through these culture war wedge issues that we're all
gathering. Totally. Yeah. And you know, what's interesting too is, like, again, prioritizing, like, my priority in recent years, the current makeup of the Republican Party and Democratic Party, no contest for me. I want Democrats, you know, controlling as of right now. I get the you know, it's just how it is. It's not even a developmental thing. It's just, this is how the government is, all the different faults in our democratic structures and things like that. That's where I would go with. So, but I have plenty of criticisms of Democrats, but it's not on equal level for me in that sense of, like, as of right now. I do think about the future of, like, how is this going to unfold? And at one day I might very well feel very differently, you know, and it all matters about how we're playing out our politics now, you know. But, you know, it's interesting of, like, you know, it would be good for Democrats to own the moral authority to which they really we express. It's like, no, this is a better way to be ethical and to treat other human beings, and we think you should follow suit. Like, to own that out loud, in which case it would be moral authority, not authoritarianism, you know, in the culture. I think that's the difference there. But that's an interesting point you bring up, because, like, to not just really own the authority that's already happening or that we're embodying, you know, then it gives that away as a vacuum to another party to try to hijack that, you know. And so these are these weird little issues where it's like we have to be, I think we have to be careful in prioritizing them of like the situation, what's going on, but to realize that some of these things are really issue, like the deadlock, you know, even that there's a tie in the Senate right now, is still pretty darn limiting right now. And so it's just like, and we don't really know, is it going to be like this in the next election? Is it going to flip back? Are we going to be just doing this for 5 years, 10 years? We don't really know. And so that scares me, because like, I don't, who on any side of the party, who wants it to be 50-50? Nobody wants it to be 50-50. And so like, it's like, man, it could be kind of like that for a while unless we shift some things, and we need things to shift. I don't think there's very many people who think, this is all, everything is great in the world. Right. Who says that? Nobody. So we can all get on the board and say, hey, we're all in agreement that we don't like things, and having a 50-50 split sucks. So what are we going to do? You know?
And that's the rub, right? What are we going to do? Because I remain convinced that there's nothing we can do other than invent new platforms in the lower right for this type of discourse. Because I think all of this is an inevitable product of our technologies and sort of the condition of the discourse itself.
Yeah, it's very true.
There's a lot of this stuff that's been flowing from the top down, for sure. I mean, we can look at, Newt Gingrich in the 90s, and we can look at, what's his name, Grover Norquist. I mean, we can talk about sort of, the radicalization that's been happening in the upper echelons, but all of that gets sort of recapitulated on social media and worsened on social media. And I really do think that so much of the tribalization. I mean, look, QAnon never would have gotten out of the gate.
Oh no, I know. No, this is a good example. And I've made, I know at some point in time I made kind of the joking about this, where it's like a long time ago, if you had a kooky neighbor spouting off stuff, you'd be just like, shut up, Bob, nobody's listening. And that'd be the end of it. But you're on social media, it's like, damn, Bob, he said some good stuff. Like, it's like, boom, press the button, and everybody in the world knows about it. So it's undeniable that like how greased up and instantaneous in the limitations of social media is part of the factor, you know, 100%. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing too is, I want to agree with you. You made an important point, which is, I don't want to make the perfect into the enemy of the good. I'll take something, even if it's flawed, over nothing. Right. And I hear that point, and I largely agree with that point. I would say like 9 times out of 10, I agree with that point.
Well, I had the additional part on there, so long as it doesn't cause equal or greater harm. And
that's the 1 out of 10. Right. Yeah. So I think, for example, at the Black Lives Matter protests, and some of which did become violent. We did have looting. We did have arson. We did have people getting hurt in the streets. This stuff, I mean, this is reality. This stuff happened. I don't think it's fair to characterize the entire protest movement based on, that violence. However, the protest movement itself didn't do a very good job of distancing itself and denouncing that kind of. Instead, we started seeing think pieces about, the right to riot, and how rioting is actually a healthy expression. And this is a fine, tactic when it comes to creating social change. And, I can even make partial room for that, because I've asked the question before. I've invoked John F. Kennedy when he says that, those who make peaceful social revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. I'm sensitive to that like there's only so much pressure a system can take without changing before things go violent. I'm always an advocate for change the system before it gets violent. Right? Because that violence is going to be inevitable. However, when that violence does erupt, we need to see a wave of leadership that we have not seen on the left. This is, I think, one of the left's big Achilles heel right now, is that it is completely decentralized. They take decentralization as a core value oftentimes, right? And that decentralization, we saw it with the Occupy Wall Street movement. No strong leadership came out of that. Meanwhile, look at the Tea Party. Those guys took over the GOP, right? This leadership emerged out of their movement on that side of the road. Whatever criticisms we might have about that movement, it produced results. And we don't see the same type. We don't see the new Martin Luther King Jr. emerging, right? and actually making a case for nonviolent resistance.
Well, you know, I think probably with that, I mean, just one thing that comes to my mind is like it's bizarre because you know, on one hand, it's like, you know, green and integral really necessarily embraces a universality, right? A world centrism. But in green, you know, there's an emphasis on recognizing the very real differences that exist, to not wash over them, to not, you know, do like say Black Lives Matter and then all lives matter. No, we have to understand the differences that exist, but there's so much emphasis on differences that sometimes our universal connection is lost, which is a glue, you know. And I know it's a balance because you can't just go like, oh, well, we'll just only do universal solutions and not have any custom made solutions to address the real imbalances. No, but yeah, if we lose some universality there, it's going to be difficult to unify enough people. You know, one thing I want to say, you brought up actually many of these points, but you know, with the Black Lives Matter protests and the violence, that's one of those things where I'm like, well, I wouldn't necessarily rank it as like it caused more harm than good. I don't arrive at that conclusion necessarily. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that there's not criticisms and an analysis of like what was good and what was bad, but just, you know, like if I do an equation, I don't go, that was horrible and it was, you know, it should never have happened. You know, I'm like, well, it happened and here's the conclusion for it. But you brought up a good point. You know, about acknowledging broken systems resulting in violence if they're not fixed. And that's the bigger point here to me. So when I watch last month, I mean, seriously, I'm just like, beyond being theoretical and integral, this, that, and the other, I'm just like looking at the news. I'm seeing public mass shootings literally every other day. I'm seeing the, you know, African Americans being shot by police every other day. And I'm not even talking about statistics. It's just like, what I'm seeing is too much. It's just too much. Yeah. It's like it's broken, and no amount of discussion from people as a society. Like if you take polls and like what people agree on, majority, none of it's having an effect. Okay. Like it's at a point where it's like nothing we're doing having an effect. And I'm not saying like let's get violent. I'm just saying like I'm just not gonna be surprised if shit gets violent, because all of the normal means to try to enact change through our existing systems isn't working. And I'm just saying that's a fact. Like it's just not working. Like, and I wish it would work. And I just watched a video yesterday. I didn't know much about Romania, and I watched a video about the Romanian dictator from, I think it was like 90s or 80s. And he went just crazy. I mean, he's already crazy like dictator, but he went off the deep end to where everybody turned on him. It was like, it was inevitable. So like the military turned on him. They arrested him and his wife in their 70s, put him on trial quickly, gave them an execution, and took him right outside and shot him with machine guns. On video, they videotaped the entire trial, the execution, to show to all the people, because stuff had gotten so crazy bad that they were like, this is where they were ended up. And you watch it, you can't feel good watching it. You're like, oh my God, this is horrifying. That like you're just mowing a couple people in their 70s down, and of course they did horrific stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it was inevitable. So always like it was inevitable because it was allowed to get to that point. And it's horrifying. So it's just like, you know, that's an extreme example, but I'm just like, so what are we going to do collectively to try to prevent things to get to violent levels, rather than just criticizing the violence when it arises, you know?
I think you just put your finger on something really, really important. The fact that we have, like, you know, take gun violence, for example.
Yeah.
The fact that we have, you know, upwards of like 80% agreement in this country across political divides around some of these solutions, right? Somewhere around 80% of people agree that we should have background checks, agree that we should eliminate gun show loopholes, agree, you know what I mean? There's agree in some sort of registry, agree that we need to, you know, get firearms out of the hands of mentally ill people. I mean, there's a lot of agreement when it comes to these issues. Now, we can have an argument over whether any of these is actually going to have any effect on the rates of gun violence out there. And I think there's probably strong arguments to be made on either side of each one of those. But the fact that we have such collective buy-in on a certain set of solutions, and none of those solutions get enacted because we have a system that's clearly removed from us, right? And has an over resilience to change. The fact that, I mean, this is an unstoppable force hitting an unmovable wall.
This is exactly right. It's exactly right. And it's something that I'm just saying as a fact. Like if you're just saying like, I'm just going to take a sociological observation here as dispassionate as one could do, people are not going to continue accepting nothing changing. That's all I'll say. People are not going to accept nothing changing. And so regardless of whatever we say in terms of like a disconnect, detached conversation, watch for something to happen. The scales will tip and some shit's going to go down. Either it's going to be done through healthy collective democratic means, or it's going to happen through violence, or it's going to happen through something, but something's going to happen. It's just not going to stay. It's not going to tolerate nothing in a gridlock culturally and democratically. I want to bring up one thing because I saw this in the comments about people were talking about UBIs, and UBI is something I've talked about before as an example of something that I would personally really support, and as an example of something that could be great starting points to heal the cultural divide. So I was seeing some comments in there about a universal basic income being a great solution because it impacts everyone. So it's universal. And I agree. It's really good. It affects everybody who's especially impoverished. What I will say is it's not going to impact everybody in the equal manner because there's disproportionate amount of people impoverished in this country. Not everybody's impoverished equally, across racial divides and different identities, but it's a great solution because it's like, if it's really universally impacted, then everybody it helps everybody, especially in the poverty level, lower level income, but it really impacts strongly, for example, the African-American community. There's just no doubt that it would impact that community to greater proportions. So it's a really lovely solution. I also love things like infrastructure. I haven't looked at detailed Biden's infrastructure plan, but like ideas around infrastructure that could help address many issues that could give a lot of jobs. It could give a lot of jobs across the board in rural areas and for populations that are lacking jobs, So I tend to lean towards that solution, it's low hanging fruit. That's what I would say. I'm not saying it's like, this is the best thing we should do. We should absolutely do this over everything else. But I'm just like, it's like no brainer stuff to me. Like, do the things that would universally impact everybody, but in a positive way, disproportionately help people who really, really need it. And let's just do it. And
political formula, do popular things.
And
popular.
Yeah. And for example, we know that like right now, there are artificial obstacles built into our governance system right now that don't reflect the people. It just, whether like the operating system just needs updated, because it's like, what operating system doesn't need updated? Who would use any operating system for a computer from 1980, let alone 200 some years ago?
What do you mean, man? I'm on Windows Me right now.
Yeah, totally. Right. So it's like, there's obstacles that are like getting in the way from us doing probably some things that we would collectively just choose to do. Right. But I would at least want to do the low-hanging fruit stuff. There seems like a lot that are really good that would have serious impact around a lot of values that people really care about.
Yep. Two things I want to say. So first, I want to respond to your comment that you wouldn't say the violence that occurred during the BLM movements overly damaged the BLM movement itself. I agree if we're talking about people on the left who already agree with the main values of BLM. I think the problem with the violence is that, especially the lack of response on the left around the violence, the problem that it created was it allowed like roughly half the population of this country to completely delegitimize and disavow Black Lives Matter altogether. So a baby was lost in the bathwater there.
Maybe. I mean, like, I think that's like, I would agree with you. It's a good thing to look at. And that certainly happened to a certain degree. As far as like, to what degree that did it, like, I think it would be like a little bit pulling out of thin air. Was it 50% of people? Was it 25% of people? I don't know whether that's the case. That's why for me, I can't draw the line and say definitively like it was worse than it did better, because there's the Black Lives Movement, which like, what is the movement? Is it all the people who use the hashtag? Because if I just say like people who say like, I wasn't a movement, I wasn't posting on social media, but I'm Black, like, I don't know that my Uncle Eddie was who's Black, I was on social media posting it, but how did he feel? Like, how did people who aren't identified concretely with the movement, did it positively impact their lives, and where they feel like, hey, finally somebody's got my back, so anyways, I'm not saying like, again, we gotta unpack it all in a nuanced way and call what is good and call what is bad.
Yep.
That all still stands.
Right.
So like all the criticism stand. I agree with you. Like there was bad messaging, like going right to defund the police was like
you lost all that. I mean, changes were actually happening until you did that. I mean, it's all, again, it's one of the first points you made in this show. It's all about sort of the semiotics of social transformation.
Yeah. And that's, it's just about language, their messaging. Yeah. I'm all about like completely revamping radically police departments. That means looking at budget, unpacking what services they do, limiting that, like totally revamping everything. So I'm not opposed to radically, but like the messaging, like you brought up many times,
because the game is to make certain words as radioactive as you possibly can.
Yeah, that was probably the most damaging to me, in the sense of like this police thing is a real issue. Like to me, it is an issue. It's like it needs to be addressed.
We had buy-in on the left and the right.
Yeah, it needs a big time.
Yep.
But yeah, we got to look out for those messages, right?
Yep. UBI. I want to now shift over to UBI because I love UBI. I mean, I'm a big fan of UBI. I think it's really, really challenging to create a system that works, right?
Sure.
I think that's a huge challenge, but I do think something like universal basic income should replace the safety net that we currently have, because the safety net that we currently have has holes in it, and people fall through those holes every damn day. And I think something like a UBI is a way to tighten up that net. You know, it fits in with my overall political philosophy. And I want to be clear here too, that whenever I'm talking about politics, I try to discern between sort of three different styles of talking about it. There's political philosophy, right? How this all looks on paper, right?
Yeah.
Then there's like political reality, which never looks like what you just wrote down on paper.
Yeah, right.
Right. And that political reality is, you know, the constituents. What do the voters think? How are the voters behaving?
Yeah.
You know, what do they support? What don't they support? What are the values, views, etc. And then there's the actual specific social hold-ons of like the Democratic Party and the GOP itself. And we can, you know, I mean, there's never a straight line that goes from political theory into the constituency into the social hold-on. That's, you know, you always lose some signal.
Yeah, totally.
With each of those steps. So I want to be, you know, if we're sitting here talking and we're like, for example, shitting on the GOP, that doesn't mean we're shitting on conservative values. I have many of them myself.
No, well, that's why I said earlier about like how the party is currently, I don't want to confuse the label Republican Democrat with any developmental structures or values. Like we can now analyze them both, but like it's just the current makeup of it is just what it is. So like if we're talking typologically liberal, typologically conservative, then I'm like, there should always be a nice creative tension with that, at least if we're not, and that's just saying that there's only two there, you know, like whether alone, you know, but the current makeup, like, and what's enacted is just like an express is like, that's a different thing.
That's right. Yeah. When we're talking political philosophies, we can talk about these things as polarities that we want to manage and we want to integrate. When it comes to social hold-ons, those are not polarities. We don't manage and integrate social hold-ons. These things don't just fit together the way, for example, you would see on philosophy. So speaking of political philosophy, my own political philosophy, I call myself and people kind of laugh at this, I call myself a Maslow socialist, or if that triggers you, I'm a Maslow capitalist. And what that basically means is let's socialize the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy. And the good news here, guys, is most of them already are, right? We just have to complete the circuit. But I think that shelter, food, basic needs here, guys, water, I mean, education, right? All of these things are like exist in the first 2 or 3 levels of Maslow's hierarchy. I think that needs to be collectivized. I think that we have a social obligation to each other to provide these things for each other so that we can have a more healthy, vibrant, and equitable society as a result. And then capitalism is for those basically mid to high rungs, right? That's where you get your self-esteem needs. That's where you get, you know what I mean? But you're not going to get your belongingness needs met in a capitalist structure. As we've seen over the last 40 years of neoliberalism, which has completely eroded the private sphere. And I think my own philosophy, my own theory here is that has generated all of these mental illnesses that we're seeing whenever someone brings a gun into a school or into Walmart and starts mowing everybody down. A
Well,
big part of this is
yeah.
the abandonment of the private sphere, which was an unintentional byproduct of the feminist movement and women moving out of the private and into the public for the very first time. It's not like we had an equivalent number of men moving out of the public and into the private to keep that going. Instead, we just said, you know, fuck the private. I'm going to get all my needs met in the public, right? And we have sort of conformed ourselves to these, you know, this set of neoliberal ideals and values, including individualism and hyper competition, etc. Sure. We've taken this onto ourselves, and we use that as a substitute gratification for genuine community and for the genuine type of belongingness and the intrinsic values that come from being part of a community.
Yeah.
Right? This is a big deal for men in particular who have a hard time feeling their intrinsic value, which is, you know, all we have is our extrinsic value. What is the value that we create for other people in our society? And this is why when men lose their jobs or lose their spouse, right, they're losing their extrinsic value or their only source of intrinsic value, their marriage, they kill themselves. Men tend to, you know, kill themselves after either of those two big traumas occur to them. Men are particularly vulnerable to this because we don't have anything in society saying you are valuable just because of who you are, not because of what you do or what you provide, but just simply being you. You are valuable and we see your value, and, you know, that's missing these days.
Yeah. Well, I really like the Maslow example there and what you laid out too. I feel pretty similar, you know. And this is another reason why, like with languaging and linguistics, I tend to avoid certain terms, like, you know, you said socialism, social what is it, social democracy, what is it, the term of
socialist, there's social democrats, and then there's democratic
social democrats. Yeah, so
apparently there's a really important
all these terms they'll like automatically bring up like past associations and versions of them, so I'm like, I got to use something completely different. Like, that's why I prefer that would make a person have to think, well, what are you actually talking about? Because what you're talking about here is like a combination, an integral kind of approach to this. And this sounds really good. And in terms of like other integral folks I've talked to, this is kind of a general approach of like socialize some of it and then let other of it be free and open, you know, in those ways. And, you know, it's interesting, a couple of things, like with if you socialize, finish, polish, which you already said, we're already doing this in so many ways, polish it, make it really work for those bottom rungs. Well, how many people are just going to, like you said, just feel better, how like they'll feel that they belong to something automatically because it's like, well, I'm taken care of and I don't have to stress about these particular things, so it's easier for me to form relationships. Like, that sets a foundation to where those other rungs can be done in a much easier fashion. And then, you know, with capitalism, like we've talked a lot about, like, we're not talking about getting rid of capitalism, but it needs an upgrade, you know, because if capitalism is impacting and intruding and impeding those bottom rungs, then that's a no-go.
That's right.
Because the top rungs sit on the bottom ones.
Yep.
So like, we just gotta like, let's polish up those bottom rungs. Let's make sure that the top rung works well, but doesn't interfere and impact these lower rungs. And then let's see where we're at, you know, with that. So I'm pretty much aligned in that model you just gave.
And you're totally right that these words have become radioactive. Both capitalism is now a radioactive term for some people, and socialism is a radioactive term.
It's part of just language. It's understandable. Exactly. Like, these words have too many reference points. And so, yeah, it's hard to use them.
Yep. Really what we're asking for is a healthy, I mean, look, when it comes to integral politics, I mean, we already have the map here, right? We already see the main polarities that need to be integrated. We need to integrate interior causation with exterior causation. Sometimes you suffer because the system is stacked against you. Sometimes you suffer because you lack interior values and work ethic, etc. Both are true. Both are true. Again, this is what made Martin Luther King Jr. such an amazing leader, was that he had prescriptions in all four quadrants.
Yeah, totally.
Quadrants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, the system is stacked against you. That's why character is so important. And you have a higher bar to meet because the system is stacked against you.
Yeah.
And I know you can do this. I know you can live up to that bar, right? Yeah. That was a style of leadership that integrated interior and exterior. Yeah. We're also talking about integrating individual and collective. I'm a big fan of individualism. I'm a big
Yeah.
fan of privacy.
Absolutely.
I'm a big, you know what I mean? These are genuine virtues that need to be preserved. I'm also a big fan of helping people who need help. I'm a big fan of never denying a little girl, surgery because of how the insurance network is stacked. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're sick of seeing these horrible shootings every day. You know what I'm sick of seeing? I'm sick of seeing these dystopian stories reframed as like feel good human interest stories. Like, fourth grader raises, $6,000 to pay off the school lunch debt for her classmates. That the state wouldn't take them from their parents. And everyone's like, oh, what an amazing little girl. And it's like, no, fuck the type of system that produces these results in the first place.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yep. See it all the time. And GoFundMe stories are often like that, where it's just like on one hand, it's like, well, thank goodness that person was able to get that money to help, deal with, healthcare costs or planning a funeral, and dealing with that. But it's like, holy shit. It's just like, then you got to think like, I hope you win a draw and be able to get a GoFundMe campaign when you need it, because there's not many other options, right?
Dude, I feel really this sad. in my heart. I mean, when my little girl got sick, when she got diagnosed and we realized she needed a liver transplant, we did a GoFundMe. Right. And like Ken Wilber was nice enough to write a letter, a whole list I could send out. And how people showed up for my family.
I remember that.
I'm so indebted to this community for the way they showed up to my family. And now, my daughter has a bank account that can only be used for medical expenses. Right. That's the stipulation of the fundraising that we did. And that's going to last her. So if anything happens, if she needs another transplant down the line and insurance, she has, something to kind of fall back on.
That's awesome.
That was huge for me. And
I know,
in a community of families dealing with nightmares that are worse than ours, we got the best case scenario of a worst case scenario, right? There are other families who are dealing with much worse case scenarios than we did. And these people don't have access to a network of big-hearted, big-brained people who care about each other, right? I had an opportunity, I had a privilege by being in this community that most other people, the vast majority of other people in this situation, don't have. And I get pissed off that I live in, and to whatever extent I do, I support a society that produces these results.
100%, man. 100%. Well, and kind of tying this to circling back around of like prioritizing problems and like that looking for something versus nothing, not doing anything so long as not causing greater harm. I think what I'm just seeing more and more is that, saying it a different way, the gross nature of the problems are increasing to such a degree that it overshadows the more subtle or nuances that I might debate in addressing those gross problems. So if we go to a fire, if there's a fire in the trash can outside, okay, it's like it's in a trash can. But if that fire spreads to the garage, and then the garage is like, if the whole, my reaction changes to how intense the problem is, where I'm just like, I'm going to debate nuances less and less and less, because it's just like one way or another, we got to solve the gross problem, even if we have valid criticism. So this is like a constant thing that we're feeling into, and it fluxes, like I said, I think a lot of us feel some relief, we say the pandemic is going in a direction of lightening up and opening up. And so we're feeling a fire being put out, but then we see news stories like this, like every other day. And then sometimes that feels like those problems are growing in intensity. So I just put that out there, that like to not acknowledge like different levels of intensity, to me, is one, not very integral.
It's not skillful. It's not going to build.
It's not skillful. It's not effective. And that's going to impact the conversation. Like before we even start talking about the details of how to respond to things, it impacts it for me. That's and right. I know that there's going to be some subjectivity to that. And then we have to look at like, how do we talk about evidence and facts around a situation such that we're going to interpret all these things,
that's right.
play out. But yeah.
Yep. Well, I also want to speak to, a few things that make me hopeful.
Yeah.
At least more hopeful. I'm actually more hopeful about where wokeism is heading than I am about where, for example, QAnon is heading. And the only reason for that, again, I see them as largely equivalent in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, I see them as largely equivalent. However, the reason why I'm hopeful is that I simply see more pushback on the left against some of this.
Totally. I've seen that too.
You see it in more leftist media. You see it now, I want to kind of punctuate that point in a moment. But on the right, there was a study that came out of Forbes magazine. I don't know if they did the study or they just sort of publicized it, but apparently 65% of self-identifying conservatives, GOP voters, 65% of them believe in some or all of QAnon. This to me is a big problem. Yeah. Right? A really big problem. Yes. Wokeism, meanwhile, on the left, here's what's weird about it. And I do think this is weird. There's something asymmetrical about this. There have been studies, and I don't have them in front of me right now, unfortunately, but the studies show that the people on the left, well, the people in this country who share the same values as the wokeists, it's a pretty small margin. It's like 10 to 12% of people or something like that. I have to refresh my stats here. If it's wildly different, I'll point it out in the notes below. But I believe it's something, south of 15%. And yet they're having making such enormous waves in academia, which makes sense. That's where all the young people are, right? They're all kind of clustered together. So it kind of makes sense that the lunatics would take over the asylum at some point. But also in pop culture and Hollywood and, even in journalism. So it's weird that they're having a sort of asymmetrical impact in our culture when not really so many people actually.
No, totally. Yes.
And part of me, Ryan, my theory for this is I actually think a lot of this is sort of the dog is being wagged from the top down by corporations, because every 20 or so years, all the major corporations go into this like panicked frenzy where they have to figure out how to communicate to a new generation.
Yeah, totally.
You see it with Coke, you see it with Gillette, with Nike. I mean, all these big corporations. And I think that this is their sort of cynical way of trying to talk to new generations so that they can get their money. So they use woke language, and then
that's 100%. That's why I'm never like, oh wow, Coke did this thing. I'm like, right. For sure, like if they're doing things that cause less harm in the messaging that has a positive impact, for sure I can acknowledge that, but I'm not going to like impart upon them some interior consciousness of why they're doing it. I'm like, and listen, sometimes a corporation has the interiors to match it. I'm not going to say that's never the case, but I'm just like, I'm not like. They're like, it's like, what gets the money? Oh, the survey says, well, this is our message. I don't care. Like, it'll make the money, and that includes actions like, well, this is the action we need to do because otherwise we lose too much market share or whatever. Like,
exactly.
Come on.
Exactly. Our competitors will message to these people better and they'll eat our lunch.
That's absolutely.
So I think there is that sort of cynical, hey, capitalism, right?
Yeah. 100%.
Should we open things up and
let's do that because we're getting towards my I gotta go pee time. So
this dude always has to pee.
Well, I'm drinking so many liquids. I'm dropping pound like Topo Chico and espressos over here.
Didn't you pee in the shower right before you came?
Always. But
hey, you got to keep your feet clean somehow. Madonna taught us that. If anyone has any questions, Phyllis, I know you had a question earlier. If you still want to ask it, raise your hand or hit the Q&A button and type something in. We'll respond to it. And, I guess one of my questions for you guys, which maybe you guys can respond to, is does this reframing help you at all? I mean, does talking about this in terms of, a post-woke frame, is that helpful? Is it helpful for you to think of green as pre-integral rather than postmodern? I don't know why it's been so helpful for me, but it has been. Again, I think because a lot of these terms have become radioactive. If a word is sitting in your shadow, it naturally has some radioactivity to it. And my sense is that for a lot of us here in Integral Land, there's some green terms that we probably want to take back and reintegrate.
Yeah, I think like what's interesting is now that we have this conversation, I think I'm noticing that amongst some of my closest integral friends is that seeing us try to find a way to pointedly make some criticisms, but like to reframe things in a way that's constructive, that's useful, that brings the conversation forward without like not just suck the wind out of it and deconstruct it, you know what I mean, and nothing else. So that's really good. I mean, and so like there could be other ways of framing it that could be positive, that brings the conversation forward. And so that's one thing I would encourage everybody here to do is like, okay, Corey and I threw out a few, but like maybe you have another way that like helps you embrace, transcend, and include what is needed and carry it forward, you know, to care for the spiral.
That's right. Well, that's, you know, I think that's another point I often make, Ryan, is that, you know, when we get to the teal altitude, now this is messy and we're never like at any particular,
right.
But let's just use the shorthand. When we're at a teal altitude, this is the first time that we take on all previous stages as part of our own anatomy, right? This is what the momentous leap is all about. It's no longer my stage up against everybody else's. It's now my stage and this symphony of altitudes that come before me, any of which have unique wisdoms and skills that I can draw upon. And if you are at the teal or turquoise altitude and you still have a green allergy, you're still keeping green somewhere in your unconscious, that's like walking around with your head cut off. Because that green is part of your anatomy, right? And if you deny it, you're denying one of the highest stages of your own being. So that's why I always try to, you know, invite people to take a look at their green shadows, see if they have any residue there that they want to you know, clean up and
and I was going to have another response here, but then I saw the question pop up, and I would share this response to this question.
You want me to read the question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Wheaton says, love the conversation, and it makes sense to see the worldviews the way you are expressing them. What I don't see is how to integrate or build a bridge to is that the different worldviews no longer just have different values, they now have different facts. How do you get through that? That's
yes. The first thing I was going to say, it was that like, if I would say all of us, but if I'll be tone it down a little bit, if most all of us don't have a lot of questions and some confusion about what to do, I call bullshit. Because it's like, if you're sitting there thinking like, I got all the things figured out, I have all the answers to all the problems, like, then you're part of the problem, you know? And so like, I sit with plenty of questions. Like, I don't know. That's why, like, if we talk about actual strategy, then I go, well, here's some things I think, but I I don't know. Like, we need to figure it out together. So like, this is one of those questions of like, yeah, that's a good question. And we can have some responses to it, some thoughts, but it's actually a really tough one. I think that's the just identifying that is really useful to me. Like, that's a thing that needs to be identified clearly. If we were all just identifying that, we'd be in a different situation because we'd be responding differently. We'd be like, well, we're aware of this, so at least we're not going to do things that come from a place of not acknowledging all these different developmental rungs and different ways of understanding the world, interpreting and making facts. That's right. At least we're not doing those things. But as far as figuring it out, I mean, the only example I see, Corey, is going back to children. Like, we have lots of evidence for up till basically 18 years old, more or less, about like, how do we raise and educate children through all the different developmental rungs? We do it all the time. We understand that we're not going to give algebra problems to a kindergartner.
That's right.
And it's not because they just haven't filled their bucket up enough with information. It's just like, no way, they can't comprehend it. So we say, what can they comprehend? Where's their developmental edge? How do we talk about issues to them? So we've done a lot of practice, at least in those environments, of understanding development and responding. We just haven't done it as adults.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. No, those are all really, really good points. And, you know, I just want to say, Wheaton, I think that you put your finger on like the central question of our time right now. You know, I'm getting ready to do a show with Ken this weekend. We're going to be talking about integral epistemology. And I mentioned that because you asked a question about epistemology.
This is a really good question.
Because it is true that we currently live in an epistemic breakdown, right? Total and complete epistemic breakdown. Now, that is not to say that this is an altogether new problem. We've always had different sets of facts
totally right,
for different altitudes. I mean, Ryan, you just use the let's look at kids. I mean, my second grade daughter is operating with a different set of facts than a sixth grader does and they're
Yeah.
operating with a different set of facts than a 12th grade. I mean, this is inevitable. This is, I mean, Ken calls
Inevitable.
this the myth of the given. There's no single given world out there that presents itself to us. Rather, we enact the world differently according to our cosmic address.
And the first
Right.
thing you said there sounded so pluralistic, so green.
Right? Ooh,
Watch
inhabit
out,
that.
Corey. If you didn't put that tag at the end there, it wouldn't have been integral. Like, this is a good point, though, of like that green sets up that thing of like, there's not a given. That's a big deal. Like, to say that everything's given. No, it's not given.
That's right.
So continue on.
And the problem is, so we've always had this condition of like multiple sets of facts that are sort of, you know, rubbing against each other.
Yeah.
But the problem, you know, what was different then previously, let's just say throughout the 20th century, was that we had media platforms that were curated.
Yeah.
So of all those different kinds of facts, we sort of had referees that said, okay, this is more true than that.
For better and worse.
Exactly. There's plenty of negatives that come out of that.
Yep.
However, now we live in an uncurated media space for the first time in human history, right? I mean, it used to be 2,000 years ago, the king and the queen and the church and the state, they would tell you what's real. That was the epistemics of the time. This is what's real. This is what's not real. You know, hit the Industrial Revolution. We had this, you know, in the Renaissance itself, we had this new sort of journalism that was emerging. Now we have a different platform. Yeah. And this is, I'm going to say not a pre-integral platform. We have a postmodern platform that is actually deconstructing our, you know, sort of epistemic fabric in real time. So we no longer have curators. We no longer have a platform that has any enfoldment mechanism in it whatsoever. Instead, we're all sort of the curators now. And I'm sorry, we're not qualified. We're not qualified to be those curators because every single one of us, some more than others, but every single one of us is in an informational silo of some kind. Every single one of us is subject to Google's algorithms, YouTube's algorithms, Facebook's algorithms, all of which subtly and not so subtly distort our perception of reality. For every single one of us. So we're all sort of swimming in these choppy waters together. And I remain convinced that we will self-organize our way out of this because this is the central life condition, I think, that is going to make integral relevant in the first place. How do we sort through all of these broken and competing epistemologies? How do we pull this all together into something new, bigger, deeper, wider, better?
It's heart of the challenge here.
It really is. And I do think that self-organization is largely, well, it's going to come from a few different areas. I'm hoping we see it in the lower right with new platforms. I have no idea what those platforms look like. I have no idea. I can't imagine them right now. Same. But I know they will emerge. Right? And hopefully having conversations like this along the way as like a series of breadcrumbs. I'm hoping that this acts as attractor points, just simply to let people know there's another space in which we can have these conversations. And that space doesn't need to be as reactive as every other space you find out there. Right? So I'm hoping that like by us coming together in the lower left, by you asking this amazing question, and hopefully us giving you a semi-satisfactory response, that all of this is actually creating a field. And that field is going to act as sort of a natural attractor for more conversations like these, so that when this new platform inevitably does come along, we're ready for it and we can select for it because we've already been having the conversations along the way.
It's great. I feel that. I love it, man. Well, I think that's for me a great way to cap this off, that summary you made, Corey, because that question was really at the heart of a lot of this. And I think we're going to make it there.
I think so. Wheaton just responded to us. So we'll close with his words.
Cool.
Wheaton says, thanks guys. Great viewpoints. Yes. Media did used to help us agree on many facts. Now each media outlet promotes their own facts. It's amazing to switch from CNN to Fox, just a different world. It really is a completely, literally different world. And not just opinions, but news facts. Very helpful discussion, guys. I'll look forward to your upcoming talk with Ken on this, Corey. Way to end the discussion with an optimistic view. Very nice. I like it. Well, we are evolutionaries after all. I'm a hopeless optimist. Which is actually some of my own shadow that I have to. Sometimes my friends are, Corey, maybe tone down the optimism a little bit.
I like it, buddy. We need it right now.
Pissed off for a while.
Totally.
So, Ryan, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, this was really good. This was good timing for this. It was nice to, and I appreciate everybody being here and sharing their thoughts and having the conversation.
That's right.
Yeah. Looking forward to next time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. And until next time, Ryan, see you later, buddy.
See ya.